Good evening. I would like to thank everyone for coming, listeners, for joining our conversation this evening. We'd like to express our very deep appreciation to all the folks at Transition US for the National Hub's ongoing support of the Mid-Atlantic Transition Hub's regional work. They have been fabulous, so thank you, Caroline and Maggie and Marissa. And also a special thank you to Jose Vivar of the New York City Transition Hub, who is our behind-the-scenes technology wizard genius currently holding the technology back office side of this teleconference for us this evening. So thank you to those folks and to Jose. I'd like to thank the panelists for being with us this evening to share your insights and your experience. We have with us Yasmin Stewart of the Call to Action Recovery Group from Far Rockaway, New York. Yasmin, welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me.
We have Reverend Dr. Modele Clarke, who is senior pastor of the New Progressive Baptist Church in Kingston, New York. Welcome, Reverend Clarke.
Hi, thanks for having me. I know it's going to be a pleasure.
Glad you're here. We also have Joanie Freeman, who is an initiator with the Transition Charlottesville, Albemarle, and the Transition Ecovillage in Charlottesville, Virginia. Welcome, Joanie.
It's my pleasure to be here, Pamela.
Great. This evening's discussion is about eco-justice, it's about social justice, and the transition environmental movement. Where do all of those intersect? Do they intersect? Should they intersect? So this teleseminar and all of the teleseminars in our monthly 2015 series is offered as a regional transition network. The Mid-Atlantic Transition Hub responds to the Simplicity Institute's critique of the transition movement, and that critique is entitled The Transition Movement, Questions of Diversity, Power, and Affluence. The Mid-Atlantic Transition Hub basically is pressing the Simplicity Institute's critique into service, to self-observe, to self-examine, and to note as we move forward where the potential pitfalls and potholes and what might be the most, as well as what might be the most advantageous path to take as we develop and as we build out our network, which is a constant, ongoing process a la transition. Everything is constantly shifting and changing. So on tonight's topic, the Simplicity Institute critique correctly notes that the current transition movement demographic is predominantly white, predominantly middle class, middle-aged to older, predominantly well-educated, post-materialist, small-town people. So that being said, transition initiatives are challenged to reach out, to generate interest, and especially to retain young people, people of color, and people of lesser financial means who might be the most vulnerable to climate change among many other challenges that these groups are facing. So I'm going to direct your attention to slide number 2 if you're using the PDF file. We'll be speaking this evening about how transitioners can be of true service to vulnerable communities by taking the time to listen deeply enough to understand the lines of force that are operative in such communities, to truly get the power dynamics, as well as to be aware of the history that conditions relationships that are in the present in those communities. So that's the tip of what we're going to be diving into this evening. If you move to slides 3 through 5, you'll begin to see the absolutely fabulous, innovative ways that transition initiatives have reached out and attempted to bridge racial, age, and socioeconomic divides in their communities. If you look at slide 3, which is entitled Pathways Explored, you'll see a 7-foot-tall puppet of Sojourner Truth, crafted by Amy Trumpeter, who is from Transition Rosendale, Red Wing Blackbird Puppet Theater. Amy takes these puppets and Transition Rosendale to a lot of different events, and through these puppets, There's a social commentary on diversity, on the racial divide, whatever the political issue is, through these puppets, so that art is merged with transition. And she has been successful in the moment. Maintaining momentum is the challenge. On that same slide, you'll see Ruth King, who brings mindful, meditative, contemplative approaches to cultural competency. Joanie Freeman in Charlottesville is going to speak later about the work of Ruth King in Charlottesville. Beautiful retreat, a lot of hugging, healing, goodwill, but follow-up and maintenance of the connections between communities of color and white communities were extremely difficult. Moving to slide number 4, we see our own Reverend Modele Clarke of Kingston, New York, with Rabbi Jonathan Kligler of Woodstock, New York, doing the interfaith thing. We do this a lot up here in Woodstock in terms of connecting, Woodstock and Kingston, connecting people across faith traditions, but to actually get people to work shoulder to shoulder, day to day. An initiative like a transition initiative, that's a whole other ballgame. And across from that slide is the Kingston Solidarity March, also organized by Reverend Dr. Modele Clarke. Marches are great, but maintaining the momentum is another thing. The next slide down is, again, the 7-foot-tall Sojourner puppet is now leading the Kingston Solidarity March. That was Black Lives Matter, Don't Shoot, Can't Breathe, that entire backdrop that we're working with in the United States in terms of the global sweep of tension, socioeconomic and racial tension that was seen in Paris and Belgium and all over the world. This was Kingston's response to it in that slide. And on the opposite that, we have Palestinian filmmaker Taha Adwala chatting with Rabbi Romer at a transition event that we did in Kingston about a year ago around the film Noah, putting people in front of the Noachian deluge, suggesting climate change across lots of faith traditions. Again, the event was beautiful. Maintaining momentum is a whole other thing. So, and getting people to work side by side, shoulder to shoulder, across faith communities, across racial divides, and that's the topic of our discussion this evening. So each guest speaker this evening brings a unique vantage point to eco-justice, the social justice, and inclusive diversity in the transition discussion. Yasmin's home, Rockaway, is an extreme, egregious example of the miscarriage of eco-justice. Instances in which government does not devote energy in any meaningful way to sustain meeting the needs of the most stressed and environmentally vulnerable communities. Jasmine bears witness to what government and the massive administratively top-heavy nonprofit industrial complex organizations will or will not do to impactfully remediate and assist ecologically vulnerable populations. Dr. Clarke has spent the last 25 years working to undo the kind of structural racism and classism that precipitated situations like what is manifesting in Far Rockaway, and has also tried to interest his congregation in facing the climate change facts. Joanie Freeman is a transitioner who has tried a host of innovative, compassionate ways to breach the racial divide in Charlottesville, as she and fellow transitioners have built their initiating group and the Transition Ecovillage in Charlottesville. So in a moment, I'm going to invite Yasmin to share her experience. And as she does, if you have a question for her to answer right after she's done speaking, please touch number 1 on your keypad, or number 1 through 5 actually, but touch number 1 to signal to us that you have a question. And also, while Yasmin is speaking, could you please take a look at slides number 6, 7, 8, and 9, which feature Yasmin, gives you a map of Far Rockaway so you can see how Jamaica Bay met the Atlantic Ocean and submerged Far Rockaway in 6 feet of water during Sandy. And you have pictures of the aftermath of Sandy as well as Yasmin's talking point. So Yasmin, I would like to invite you at this point to please share your experience of pre-storm isolation of Rockaway, another eco-justice issue, the profound personal loss during the storm, and what does Rockaway look like 2 years after the fact? Yasmin?
Yes. Good afternoon again, everyone. I bring you my personal experience of the Rockaways. I started living here in 2003, and I noticed that there were areas that were run down, economically depressed. There are lots of young people hanging out on the streets, seemingly not gainfully employed or engaged. Housing was a problem. Post-secondary educational opportunities was a problem. And over the years, prior to Sandy's arrival, hospitals were closed. Transportation was a difficulty, and drainage. We always had a problem with drainage whenever there was a lot of water and such in the area. So the Rockaways was really quite a vulnerable community prior to Sandy. However, Sandy aggravated everything and made it clear just how much the community was not resilient enough. It could not withstand much of the pressures that climate change could bring on, and socioeconomic standing of a resident could also not withstand the kind of destruction that Sandy brought. So as a result, the Rockaway Call to Action Long-Term Recovery Group was formed. We have been working since 2012 when Sandy struck to get residents back in their homes. To date, we have probably some 400 and more vacant lots and houses that have not yet been repaired, and residents have not returned to their homes. We also have students who are displaced. For example, students who would normally go to school in the Rockaways, they're now attending schools in Brooklyn. So we still have families displaced. And I can speak to this because I knew some of these children, and as a teacher, I meet some of them in the schools over in Brooklyn where I go to work. And these children have psychological problems. They tend to be very active in school, not sit down. But when I go in, I recognize them. I'm able to point them out that they're children of the Sandy disaster, and they need special care, and it makes a difference. So, these are all the things that, some of the things that we have had to deal with. Now, post-Sandy, during the disaster recovery period, this is where we found that the government response was inadequate. So what we had to rely on was our community groups who came out, such as churches, different cultural groups and ethnicities. They came out and they rendered assistance right away. In probably a week or so, then the government assistance started rolling in. Now, Rockaway Call to Action that I'm affiliated with was hosted by Battalion Pentecostal Assembly. And this is where the hub started to form for residents in Rockaway and the middle of the peninsula. And it's something I should explain is that we have different ethnic groups and enclaves on the Rockaway. So we have a Russian community that is largely resident in a certain area. We have an Irish community in another area. We have Hispanics and people of African descent who reside in a different area. And we have a Jewish enclave as well. So what we found during that time is that the bureaucracy manifested itself in different ways, depending on the community of the Rockaways that they were at. And what I noticed was some people waited in long lines in the cold, because remember this happened October going over into November, December, into January. Some people waited in the cold. The clothes and stuff they were to pick up were sometimes outside. So as you drove past, you could see, people there waiting in the cold and so on. Others were accommodated on the tent, fed at tables, and things like that. So it calls to mind the whole matter of social justice, diversity, and how it manifests itself in terms of access to resources. How does it happen? I also happen to be a recent immigrant. I am a professional who was recruited by a government agency. And yet, I find that even with immigration issues, which affected residents during Sandy because some people were undocumented and were afraid to come out of the shadows to get assistance. So we had to deal with those issues as well. So I was able to have this kind of perspective throughout the whole exercise. And then with my own personal loss, even though I did everything I was supposed to do, I paid my insurance, I had flood insurance, I had homeowners insurance, taxes were paid up, everything. I had to visit the Disaster Recovery Center in Auburn 40 times and more in order to get some of the value of the loss I had suffered in order to come back to a point where I could function. So I stopped counting at 40. So I went to that office over 40 times. I had to do appeals to the governor. He had a hotline, Governor Cuomo. I had to use a legal team that was provided to do an appeal just to get the insurance fund that I needed to help me with recovery. So, of course, we had people who couldn't do that. What about our seniors? What about the people with disability? What about the people who spoke a different language other than English? They struggled. So, and now we still have people who have not even returned to the area. We don't know what has happened to them. We can see they're in the shadows, some of them. So we found community groups, churches, filled our need, especially for a hot meal. And the Battalion Pentecostal, they hosted and were able to have a staging area there for food, clothing, other supplies, housed the National Guard when they came on board, the Red Cross, and other, utility companies and services. So how have we evolved since? Well, again, we have in place the community group, a long-term recovery group of Rockaway Call to Action, and we meet and we try to address the needs that our residents still have outstanding. And now we are partnering with the Transition Hub. We want to get involved with that so that we can reach out to more of our residents, have them involved, and work towards resiliency. But unfortunately, I must say that 2 years after Sandy, the problems of access to jobs with a living wage, fresh food, affordable housing, and access to resources in an equitable way, they still remain. Issues of immigration, issues of race, they still remain 2 years after Sandy. And our young men are just hanging out. They're getting lost in the fray. So we have a lot of issues, a lot of things we need to work on as communities in the Rockaways. And it's welcome to really have the transition movement reaching out in this way to the peninsula.
Thank you very, very much, Elsa. Yes, we have a question from Frank. Frank, would you like to address the question to Yasmin?
Which Frank is that?
Frank Southworth.
Yes.
Yes, Frank.
Yasmin, that was a fantastic presentation. I'm overwhelmed and I'm very moved by it. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay. I'm just thinking. As you were writing, I was composing a letter in my head to Pamela saying, "Look, we here on the Upper West Side want to send a message to you and to the people of this country who have let this happen."
You're breaking up a bit. Can you repeat that question, please?
Okay. I feel, I'm just talking off the top of my head. I don't know yet what I'm going to say. But
okay.
I feel we need to send a message. We of the Upper West Side, and I will appeal to all my members and anybody else I can think of, we need to send a message to you, to the people of New York, and to the people in the various governments that let this happen.
Yes.
And we don't want it to happen again, and we want to let people know that we here recognize that you and we are part of one people. And we must not let this happen, and we will, and we want to do whatever is in our power to start making this right. And we would love. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, just to respond to what you said now, in that, you see, every situation has its complexities. And it's when we engage with each other. We have the conversations that we're having now, that we get an understanding of what a person is going through. And what I like about the Transition Hub is that if we have these in communities and people know this is my go-to place, then probably we can alleviate a whole lot of, stuff that we'd rather not deal with. Yeah.
Both Frank and Yasmin, I want to affirm what both of you have been saying in the sense that, Frank, you are, in fact, in the Upper West Side transitioning your neighborhood as part of the New York hub. Yasmin's colleagues and friends from Far Rockaway have been in the room with us at the New York Transition Hub. So just by connecting transitioner to transitioner, neighborhood to neighborhood, Upper West Side, Lower East Side, Far Rockaway, etc., you are doing a tremendous service right now, every time we come together in the New York Hub. And I think Rockaway, as Yasmin is saying, is feeling more connected. As the first part of the presentation, I think, was about pre-Sandy. Rockaway was the forgotten New York. You in the Upper West Side, when you sit in that meeting house and you're connecting with Queens, you're doing it, Frank. And so I just want to affirm both of you. And there's another couple of hands up. Couple of hands up for Yasmin. Thank you, Frank. I'd like to acknowledge Bob Nash.
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. This is Bob Nash from Arkansas. In order to make 3 quick points. One, as a person who's been involved in the disaster response and recovery business for the last several years, I know that major institutions do not respond to low-income, particularly people of color, when these disasters happen like they do other places, number one. Number two, I know that the better organized communities are, the more responsive decision makers, opinion leaders, and those in leadership positions will respond to them because they know they're organized and they know what they want. The last comment I'll make is this. No one knows more about what the needs are in a low-income community in times of disaster like the folks in the community if they're organized. Things like where the elderly live, where the handicapped live, where there are young children. And when you're organized, you can get more done, and you can get a better response from those who are in charge.
Thank you very, very much, Bob. I know that you also have been working at this forever. Yes. Yes. I have totally affirmed. I'd like to take a question from Derek for Yasmin.
Well, let me respond a little bit to Bob.
Oh, to Bob? Go for it.
Yes,
yes.
and while Derek, yes, I'll be quick about this, because when you say that the authorities do not respond as quickly to low-income people of color, to me that needs to change, because what I found is that these people need the assistance even more, because sometimes they can't even articulate the needs. So, I think the authorities ought to be organized to really offer a certain amount of support to all communities, really. I don't see that you need advocates right after a disaster. There are certain things that should be in place for each resident. That's what I'm thinking. But I take your point.
Yes, I agree. It doesn't need to be just after a disaster. It needs to be on an ongoing basis. But the same principle applies. When communities are organized and they know what the problems and needs are in their community, they will get more of a positive response from the people who are in charge than you would if the community is not organized and hadn't talked about what the needs are in their community.
I agree, and I saw it happen. And what I was very sad, though, for seniors, especially those who were veterans. And there is a disaster recovery center set up by FEMA, and these people could not do the 40 visits that I did, and they just did not get any help.
I understand.
Thank you very, very much. We're going to take Bob. Thank you. Thank you for being on the call.
Okay.
I'm going to take a call from Derek, and
yes.
I see a couple more hands. What we're going to do is we're going to ask Derek to ask his question, and then we'll move on to Reverend Clarke, and we'll come back to Larry and some of the other folks who have their hands up at the end of the presentations, if you don't mind. So, Derek, would you like to ask your question of Yasmin?
Yes. So since you didn't use my last name, I'm going to be a little more blunt here. I was part of the FEMA response in New Jersey to Sandy, and I have to say that from that side of the table, all government assistance is aimed at protecting and helping property. And that's why the low-income neighborhoods fall off the table and can't get the assistance they need. The government assistance is not aimed at helping neighbors. It's aimed at helping property owners. And so back to what Bob was saying, the community needs to come together. The only real healing that happens after any disaster is neighbor helping neighbor. And I've done disaster response not just with FEMA, but also with international groups in Haiti and places like that. Neighbor helping neighbor is where this happens, and it doesn't happen well or easily if you wait until the disaster strikes to start. You need to start now and build that community. And then you don't need the government because the community is taking care of itself. That's really the solution here.
Yes. Take your point, and I've written it down. Both Bob and Derek and Frank, taking your points.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yasmin, thank you very much. We can double back around for some other hands that are up. And I think everyone that spoke to these points is going to be very inspired by what Far Rockaway is doing now in response to the recognition that government isn't there for all of the reasons Bob and Derek just mentioned. Rockaway is got it going on now, and we're going to hear about that a bit later. So thank you all. Yasmin, I'm going to...
Yeah, my pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much. Invite Dr. Clarke, whose Solidarity, End the New Jim Crow, and Undoing Racism work is featured in slides 11 to 12, 10 through 12. Dr. Clarke, what has been your experience in trying to engage your congregation over the years in environmental and eco-justice and even sustained social justice work?
Pamela, first of all, thanks for having me participate in this. This has been a great experience so far. I want to talk a little bit about the challenge of engaging disadvantaged communities in any sustained conversation about the impact of climate change on their lives. And I want to use, to illustrate something that happened in this community. We all remember that in late August 2011, when Tropical Storm Irene slammed into the eastern seaboard. Well, in our area, we were impacted by that, and I was part of a group of people standing on the Route 9W overpass, looking down at the roundabout section of Kingston. And what we saw was the roundabout creek had flooded its banks, and we were trying to identify the submerged streets and the flooded buildings below. Now, that section of Kingston is comprised of a diverse working class neighborhood of used to be factory workers back in the days who employed at the brickyards. And these brickyards stretch along the eastern banks of the mighty Hudson River. But they are long gone now. So what we have in its place, the working poor, the unemployed, and the underemployed. There are a few trendy restaurants that try to attract the area's, I guess, professional folk along Lower Broadway. But the area we're talking about is called the Strand. It's a street that winds along parallel to the Roundabout Creek. Well, I'm trying to get you to picture these people. I'm part of them, and we're looking down at this mass of rising water, and there's a feeling of sadness because you're seeing homes being flooded, you're seeing businesses being flooded, and there were these two churches. One stood about 50 feet across the street from the creek, and one was about 200 yards away on another block from the creek. Now, this is in a flood zone, clearly, and why people were allowed to build churches and homes, I'll never know. So for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, we opened our church to these two other churches, and we tried an experiment of having 3 churches, 1 service. Well, it worked for a while until a Jewish congregation invited one of the churches to fellowship to have their service on Sunday. Now, fast forward to October 29th, 2012, Tropical Storm Sandy. Again, we are standing on the Route 9W overpass. It's like deja vu all over again. We look at the same scene a year and 2 months later. So those congregations, those families, those businesses, you're watching helplessly as another superstorm devastated their lives again. And I'm sure more crowds will gather on that same overpass to watch other floods devastate those same communities. So what I'm saying is it's frustrating to see folk who are reluctant or maybe incapable of connecting the dots. So many of them, including churches, bought property, constructed homes in this floodplain, and these are poor folk. The challenge, as I see it, is to educate them that they are the most vulnerable to the impact of climate change. And the challenge is to weave the issues of eco-justice and social justice in communities stuck in this survival mode. So a major task for me is to convince my colleagues in the clergy who serve disadvantaged communities like mine to include, along with our emphasis on evangelism and soul saving and etc., is an exploration on why social and economic disparities exist. We have to tackle this dilemma of why the most vulnerable people are perpetually distracted by and existing in this survival mode. And like I said, I see this coming down the pike again. And we're going to stand on this overpass and look helplessly and shaking our heads, waiting for the next disaster to happen.
Thank you, Dr. Clarke. We have 2 hands up. I'm going to ask Philip if you'd like to pose a question to Dr. Clarke.
I have more of a general comment. I had simply tried to raise my hand in the previous round, but I'll just make my comment here, and that is I'm recently completing a dissertation at the University of Delaware on the transition movement, and one of the things that I noted in the research is that the transition movement has so far, up to this point, pretty much failed to give much attention to equity and social justice. And I'm very encouraged that we're having this conversation. I think it is, after 400 pages of writing, I can give you the conclusions, and that is the transition movement has to have this conversation. And so I'm thrilled that it's happening. And I must mention one thing, and that is that when this conversation happens, it creates a tension with other aspects of the transition movement, specifically the theme of political neutrality, and we've already heard that from some of the commentators, some of the speakers, as well as community building and inclusiveness. And I don't mean community building, building a community, but trying to be inclusive in the sense that that these forces that are impacting communities, climate change and macroeconomic stability, that these things they're going to impact everyone. And what we're hearing, obviously, is that that's not necessarily true, that they're impacting some people more than others. But yet at the same time, when the transition movement was created, the idea was that we are all in the same boat. And so we shouldn't pick sides. We shouldn't say it's us versus them or whatever. So I just wanted to point out to say that when we do have this conversation, that it does create some tensions with the original intent and design of the movement. So that was basically my comment, and I appreciate the Reverend's. I do appreciate the Reverend's comment about why people are building on floodplains. That's the other half of the research is in planning. And if you want the other half of the conclusions of the research, it's that transition does need to get involved at the community level, become a little bit more political, and start to shape community development through formal channels, specifically local government and planning commissions, because that can make a massive impact in the shape, form, and outcomes in community development.
Philip, thank you very much. Reverend Clarke, did you want to respond to that or have any comments
thanks,
about
Philip.
Philip's point?
Yeah, I think he made some great points, particularly at the end when he talked about involvement with municipal planning. And he's right. When these decisions are made, the people most significantly impacted are not present. So decisions are made for them or about them that will affect them, and they are clueless. They have no knowledge of what's being decided for them. So thanks, Philip. That's a great point.
Larry, you had your hand up for the previous question round, but would you want to make a comment now?
Yes, I'd love to. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
My comments are probably germane to both of these things. Now, I've been involved in the transition movement since it was the post-carbon outpost days and even before that, and I have some years of experience both with the environment and with disaster planning. And some things jumped out at me, specifically to Dr. Clarke. I'm hearing a kind of passive response of being on the bridge and watching these things happen again and again. And what I've found so far in trying to work with the concepts of transition is that we really need to become locally self-sufficient, self-resilient. And this is not easy to do. I've been trying to do it in my own township for 10 years. All due respects to the last caller, having been involved as a member of the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, I would not rely on them or local government to be part of the solution because they are really part of the problem. If you think a response to storms like, and I think back to the 50,000 refugees that are still away from the Gulf Coast from the storms that they had down there, both Rita and Katrina, and now Sandy and other storms, the government is not equipped to deal with this. It's obvious. I mean, how many examples do you need to that? But to me, the beauty of the transition movement is it empowers local governments to find, not local people, local groups to find solutions on their own. And I think that the possibility of resilience and relocalization is essential. I think that communities need, transition folks in the communities need to ask themselves, if this happens again, what can we do? What can we do for ourselves? How can we be prepared for the next one? How can we build barriers to the sea? How can we remove ourselves? I mean, there are only two responses to rising sea levels, which is going to eventually get everybody, and one is to retreat, and the other is to armor the coast, and neither of them are very possible to do in an energy-constrained world. If we think that these are difficult issues, climate change is going to pose a huge issue by comparison. I mean, it's a mega issue, and really we need to start thinking seriously, not of responses to what has passed, but just using what has passed as an example of what we need to do that's different.
Larry, thank you very much. All these points are massive portals to very large discussions, especially the political piece and how transition approaches that or doesn't approach that or what level it approaches it at. I'm going to put those on the bike rack, as we used to say parking lot. It's now the bike rack, to revisit at the end of the call because these are powerful issues. So at this point, what I'm going to do is ask transitioner Joanie Freeman from Transition Charlottesville, Albemarle, to talk about some of the strategies that she has used to engage communities of color. And Joanie, could you definitely mention Vinegar Hill, the Canning Co-op, Ruth King, et cetera, and whatever else you'd like to share. Joanie Freeman.
Well, after 6 years of traveling around the world doing volunteer work in different communities addressing environment stuff, I came into Charlottesville. Charlottesville is a very progressive community. It has a university here, very well educated. A lot of people kind of look at it as Shangri-La, recognized as one of the happiest cities in the country. And on our trips around the world, I learned about transition in Australia, in Brisbane. And it was very interesting to come into Charlottesville, and there was a couple that began to talk about transition at a Sojourner church. And 15 of us decided we were going to start up Transition Charlottesville Albemarle. All 15 people were white. And we began to plan our events of how we were going to reach out to the community. We had panels, we had discussions, we had potlucks, and consistently there was only white people that were showing up to these events. And I began to scratch the surface of Charlottesville to get a better understanding of what was going on here. Being a progressive community, it seemed like, why is there such a racial divide? And I learned about the history of urban renewal, and right in the center of the city was a predominantly black community with 2 churches and 29 businesses that were doing well, and the government came in telling cities that they had money to do urban renewal, and lo and behold, in around 1965, they demolished the entire community. And it was a community. It was a diverse economic community, a diverse educational community, but it was a black community. And they wound up building some low-income housing. A lot of people dispersed out. And the property of that community sat for 20 years, barren with nothing on it. And I met someone who said in the middle of a street that was not there, this is where my house was. They replaced it with a McDonald's and a Staples, and the community still to this day was rumbling about this event that took place. The older people dispersed into different churches in the community, and the churches were divided up, and the nonprofit scene in Charlottesville began to try to reach out and make things different, and never was able to follow through with any of the intents that the nonprofits were setting themselves up. So there began to be a mistrust of nonprofits in the community, and there began to be a mistrust within the community. I really kind of uncomfortable with the fact that transition was just a white group of people. So I took a canning class, and I was involved in a group called Food Not Bombs, where we were gleaning lovely produce out of the farmer's market and being able to set up a free market in a predominantly black community for people that were food insecure. And there was a tremendous amount of food that was brought to the park for this free market. But then there was an enormous amount of food that was left over. And while I was taking this class, I said to myself, whoa, canning, free food, and I turned to the lady who had a grant from Ball, canning company, is there any extra money to be able to start a low-income women's canning co-op? And she didn't even think for a minute, said, make me a list. I said, I can't make you a list. I don't know how to can. I'm just learning. She went out and bought everything. I got the full equipment. I got a community kitchen, certified community kitchen, to volunteer space. And then I went out to seek women who would be interested in getting involved in a business. The hardest part was getting the women. And I finally did get 4 women, and we got the extra food from the market and began to can under our nonprofit called the Healthy Food Coalition. And part of them selling in the market was they weren't selling. They were telling that the business community got wiped out in the 60s in urban renewal, and it's never rebuilt back up again fully, and that the women saw their co-op, their little co-op, as the beginning of more co-ops that the black community or even low-income people could gather together, support each other, and be able to move out of the poverty scene or the food insecure scene. And they were out there educating people, and I was then trying to think, how do I pull more people into this? The women decided to call it the Vinegar Hills Canning Co-op because that was the name of the community that got wiped out. And they looked at me and said, we should help other co-ops like this start up. So I went to one of the women's pastors, a black pastor at Ebenezer Church, and I said, I'm coming from the concept of an experiment that was started called Transition Town, and I'm really concerned about the divide, economic, social divide that exists in our community, and what will happen if things get really rough with the climate. What happens if there's a catastrophe, whether it's an earthquake, a hurricane, anything that could possibly start happening? Who is going to get hit first and worst in our community? And he shook hands with me and he said, we're partners, Joanie. And I would like you to come to my church, and I would like you to reach out and help me to begin to talk to my congregation. Well, there was absolutely no way to get his congregation to be even open to looking at climate and climate impact as a connection to the circumstances that the community could be facing, just like for Rockaway or what happened with Katrina. And we began working and talking and strategizing. In the meantime, the women are saying, let's do more co-ops. So I belong to Believers and Achievers, which is an ex-felon self-support group. And I went in, and it was predominantly black people that were in this gathering of people. And I sat and I befriended and listened and began to toss out the concept of a cooperative business. And we gathered up a group of people that were interested in doing a music co-op. And we gathered up a group of people that were interested in doing a handyman co-op. And each one struggled, and then fell apart. And I went to economic development in the city, and I said, we need help here. We need help to support people who are wanting to pull themselves up. And I have an idea. And the idea was to take a rundown grocery store that was on a piece of property that was primarily in a black neighborhood. And I said, can the city purchase this piece of property and then turn it over to the community and make the community have a place that would be a community entrepreneur cooperative center? And I got some assistance with people who would help with business plans and follow-throughs and whatever. And the city looked at me and they said, oh my gosh, it's a great idea. Go ahead and do it. And I said, I can't do it. I don't have the money to buy the property. I don't have the skill set to be able to pull this together. That's why I'm coming to the city's economic development. And it just got dropped by the wayside there. There was this struggling that constantly was sitting there of not watching our community be able to pull itself together and lift up the people that were marginalized. And in looking at the environment, and my partner and I decided we're going to plunge and group up with a group of people to start an Ecovillage. And in starting the Ecovillage, the vision of it is that it would be reflective of what takes place in the community, the population, all the activities on every community level through the different churches or whatever. Around that same time, Ruth King came into the community and did an amazing workshop. And people that were shunning each other were sitting in this workshop where this little tiny black Buddhist meditating instructor got everybody to be extremely authentic, talking real and interacting with each other and embracing each other. And it looked like such a beginning of a major shift. And the group decided that they were going to go ahead and meet once a month and continue. And that group dwindled and dwindled and dwindled, and it's still struggling to survive. There's a new attempt by a group of us to do something where when it's cold, energy costs go up because you're heating your house. Your house might not have the winterizing needs that it can cut your cost and cut your energy use. So we've got a group planning to pull together volunteers to help go into apartments and houses that are rented and help people to winterize. And whether this might be a success, I don't know. We keep trying. But unfortunately, what keeps happening is that even with what appears to me as potential close social relationships that I could build on personally, begin to disappear. I'm not sure why we can't pull it together in our community, but I do know that the economic picture, the environmental picture, the social picture, all has to come together, or else our entire community will not only suffer as it's doing now and living a facade of being this progressive place that is a Shangri-La, and when a catastrophe hits, do we wind up looking like Far Rockaway?
Thank you, Joanie. I see that Bob, did you want to make a comment or have a question for Joanie?
Yes, I do. Thank you. As a person who has worked for 3 governors and 1 president and served on the zoning commission and the planning commission, I can say that this transition movement, if it in fact, and I have a prejudice toward political action, and I don't mean political action, Democrat, Republican, Independent, but political action for the community. So when I say that policymakers respect people who are voting for their interest, I know the kind of impact it can have. If people in the community get together and go to these planning, zoning, city council meetings more than once And if they go up there and say something other than, woe is me, you got to come help me. It's got to be like some of the things she was talking about what they had done on their own. That is so impressive and so powerful and so much pressure on political policymakers that they have to take interest, and they will. If they know that you know what you want, you're going to be back time and time again. Oh, and by the way, we vote for our own interest. To the extent that the transition movement can do those kinds of things, you'll have a tremendous impact on government. Someone earlier said, government's not the answer, they're the problem. That's largely true if, in fact, you go there with nothing in your hand, if, in fact, you go there unorganized, if, in fact, you go there one time and don't come back. So I think this transition movement has the potential to have a tremendous impact on those policymakers who don't think the people in the community are going to do anything.
I need to respond to that. Unfortunately, the biggest funder of our politicians in the state of Virginia is a private energy company called Dominion. And the Dominion lobbyists literally pay for everyone who is sitting in a political seat in our legislature. And that because we have deniers. We have deniers right and left in the legislature that are not even open to thinking about anything environmental or connecting the economy or the marginalized people in the community. We do have a progressive city council in Charlottesville, but even our city council seems to spin its wheels in really getting major changes taking place to support efforts here in their own community.
Joanie, to Bob's point, I think one of the most powerful things that we discussed, and you're part of those conversations in the Mass Council all of the time, to his point, when a community organizes, when neighbors come together, when there is a plan, when there is self-empowerment, we inspire government as opposed to focusing on changing it within or policy shifts or an inordinate amount of time spent on thinking about government. To Bob's point, we can inspire government. So I just want to affirm what both of you are saying.
Can I make another statement that
Sure.
The transition group here has created one of the 14 cities that have the Transition Streets pilot that's going on. And in May, we're really planning on reaching out all over the community to bring on more Transition Street neighborhoods. So hopefully do exactly what you're talking about, Pamela.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Larry, you're back. Would you like to ask a question?
Well, you could frame it as a question, but I really enjoyed what Bob had to say, and especially what Joanie was talking about, because she spoke of the struggle to get these things together and to make things happen. One of the things that I have found in my area, working very carefully and diligently, if not experienced, is with trying to find a place where I can influence the people I would like to attract. And one of the things I found out very, very early on is that people don't care about peak oil, even if they know how to spell it. They don't care about climate change. They have heard a lot of bullshit from the energy companies, but what they do respond to is fiscal responsibility. And what I've been working with in the last 4 or 5 years is the data from Lawrence Livermore Labs that says America wastes 61 to 86% of the energy we use, and the idea, Joanie's idea of winterizing and doing home energy efficiency, I think is right on the money, because that's what I am doing. It can be done, but you have to do it carefully. You can't just go in there without any idea of how to do it. I happen to be a college-trained nationally certified sustainable building advisor, and you do need to do that in a proper way and use actual scientific data to make these places energy efficient. Otherwise, you could make it worse. So I think that is the place to put the lever, wherever you put the fulcrum. And I've had some good responses both at my Unitarian church and elsewhere in the area. When I come up to somebody and say, I can help you save $1,000 a year on your energy bills, their attention perks up. And that's less than 50% of the average person's energy bill in this area, annual energy bill. So I would like to encourage those who are working on this to use that as a possibility. But again, nothing is going to take the place of us being organized, having some successes, which you can do pretty easily with energy efficiency. And I'll say that it's also a lever that you can move government with. Any township person that I've been working with, and I was on a township committee for 10 years, I was on the Environmental Advisory Council here, if you challenge them to be energy efficient and they give you any flack, you say, well, you're not really fiscally responsible, so I don't know why I'm even listening to you. You're wasting over 60% of the energy that you're using in this town. And no one has actually come back at me over that. And, in fact, they don't even challenge me when I go into township meetings. And you can't go once, as Bob said. You can't go twice. You have to have a program, and you have to go in there again and again and again. And you become a squeaky wheel, but you have to be a good, round, squeaky wheel. And
Larry,
have your grow.
I want to affirm the persistence, the steadfast, connecting with local governments to get these things done on the energy plane. I'm going to ask you to maybe expand on how might you reach communities of color and bring people who are in socioeconomic depressed situations to the point where they're at this level of organization that you're talking about, which is kind of our puzzle or our challenge this evening, considering many transition initiatives. I know transition initiatives up and down the coast that are, in fact, that organized, and part of our job is actually to spark that and get those plates spinning and get those folks out there talking the talk about energy, et cetera. I think what Reverend Clarke has put out there, and Joanie initially was saying, it's a bit more difficult to have those engaging kind of conversations with Black communities, with Latino communities, with people who are trying to put food on the table and just are dealing with survival issues. And as you probably know, there's a voluminous amount of information about what happens when people go into survival mode and where their attention is bracketed. And I'm going to take a question from Anasha, who's up north here in New York State, in Albany, and then turn our attention to how Far Rockaway is walking the talk, a la what Bob is saying, but it's trying a different way. So I'm going to take Anasha's question first, and then we'll turn the corner back to Far Rockaway. Anasha?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. So just quick addition, a frame that I think works well to talk about energy being relevant to everybody is the localism frame. In the city of Troy, everybody is spending on average $4,000 per family, and that's going out of everybody's pocket and out of the community entirely. And so pulling that back to localism, I think, is important. And then to address your other question, certainly, more than most, I think that energy that's being wasted is impacting the low, moderate income households. And so that's why I think it's important to engage with government and other existing agencies that are working with those communities to develop and build off of existing weatherization programs that can help cut those bills that I think are some of the biggest bills these families have.
Thank you. yes, and I know that Troy is making a tremendous effort to ensure that the Solarized program is as accessible to as many parts of the population in Troy, New York as possible. So I hear you loud and clear there. Troy is Solarized Troy, which is a transition spin-off, actually, is pretty amazing. So I just want to affirm your work, Anasha. I'd like you to direct our attention back to our slides for a second. If you're looking at the PDFs, we're on 16 at this point, which is, it goes back to Far Rockaway. It says, Far Rockaway, Mid-Atlantic transitioners and permacultures, stop talking. What we have noted is that having done so many diversity seminars and the sensitivity piece and a lot of what Dr. Clarke has been doing in terms of undo racism and end Jim Crow, the social action pieces, there are places and times for the discussion, for the talking. What Rockaway, Mid-Atlantic transitioners, and permacultures have decided to do is to stop talking. And we sound like a Nike commercial, just do it. So what we're doing is transitioners, and Frank, who was on earlier, is part of the New York Transition Hub. We are listening to each other deeply. It's about not going in with an agenda of what we're conveying, the information we're transmitting, none of that. Just listening. And we're finding that when you invite folks to dig in the dirt with you, we're putting together resident permaculture installations with the Permaculture Network and the Transition Network in the area. When you're digging in the dirt next to someone, shoulder to shoulder, I have a friend in Baltimore who said this is the way she communicates in her community gardens in Baltimore. She's doing transition neighborhoods in Baltimore, the center of Baltimore. The best time to talk to people is when you're digging in the dirt with them, when you're thinking about swales and you're putting in water management systems, and you're thinking about rain barrels, because your attention is bracketed on something that is uplifting, helping the community. It's moving you forward, and you're there together experiencing each other without talking. I think at this juncture of the transition movements, as we look at the simplicity critique, so much of it has to do with pedal to the metal, shoulder to the plow at this point. So Far Rockaway, as Yasmin was saying, has decided we're going to grow food everywhere. We're looking at all kinds of urban gardening models that will be put out there. The water management system will be on a biomimicry basis on the way that the dunes and the peninsula is structured. And if you look down at there's a slide that slide number 17. You'll see Yasmin's community. It's slide number 17. They've had the community she's talking about has been feeding a big chunk of Rockaway for a long time. To Bob's point about people that take the bull by the horns and really have done it themselves, they started with a food pantry. They moved forward to gardening, and then Sandy came in. 3 inches of salt blanketed everything, so they went to raised gardens. And what you're seeing in slide number 17 is hoop houses. They're thinking of aquaponics, hydroponics, and the slide to the right was just taken last week. That is one of the congregants of the home of one of the congregants. We're going to be doing small bio-blitzes and backyard gardens for the people in Rockaway who want them, and people are stepping forward right and left. Again, without talking. Next slide down. Without talking, Rockaway neighbors have decided, and Yasmin alluded to this, that eco-justice way-showers are what they're going to be. No words, no isms, no classism, no racism, no discussion of that. Playback theater, which is a very cathartic storytelling process, will be coming in to do a long-term invitation for the residents to tell their stories, tell the resilient stories. And playback theater then universalizes the story for everyone in the room, and it is an incredible experience. So that will be offered in Rockaway, and people are availing themselves of that. Again, no word, just do it. And in the next slide down, we're going to be doing the residents of Far Rockaway for 4 years, well, 3 years, this will be the fourth time, have done a health fair. And the same community that has fed, that church community that is networked throughout the peninsula, really does the community building themselves. Literally was the recovery center for half of the peninsula when hit by Sandy. They took 6 feet of water, but right after that, they had the blankets, they had the food, and when the Red Cross and FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers and the Salvation Army came in, they came in for the photo op, left, and that church and that community was still there. They have done a health and still holding that peninsula together with the interfaith community and with residents. They've done a health fair for 3 years now. What we're doing is the New York City Transition Hub, which is embracing Far Rockaway, bringing them into the network at this point. We are partnering with them, so their health fair will also have transitioners at this time, doing reskilling demos, and permaculture people that will have been working up until that point with. Yasmin was at meetings the past couple. I'm going to turn it back to her shortly. Past couple of weeks, planning the build out of the health fair in collaboration with permaculture networks throughout the region, transition networks throughout the region, to offer the health fair, but then healthy food. Health fair, but deal with the urban desert, the food desert, et cetera, et cetera. So, again, we have, at the suggestion of Far Rockaway, decided to stop talking and just get in there and do it. The second thread there on that one piece is initiating groups, getting to the point where they know each other well enough. They're honest and frank and open about why they're doing what they're doing, why they want to reach out to communities of color, why they want to reach out to people who are different than them. Really grappling with that, looking at one's own racism, one's own classism. Because if you reach out to communities of color, if you reach out to communities that don't look like you, people feel immediately, whether it's genuine, whether it's authentic, it resonates. So in addition to actually just doing the work shoulder to shoulder, there's an attitudinal predisposition that transition initiatives need to grapple with, and really unpacking some of the things that they are bringing with them when they reach out. And that's a whole other topic unto itself. At this point, Yasmin, would you like to comment a little bit about what's planned on Far Rockaway? And we're hoping, I see people on from Wilmington, Delaware, I see people on from Baltimore. We're hoping that Far Rockaway, because I don't know a place that took that much water from the bay and the ocean on both sides, and is still standing. We're hoping what happens in Far Rockaway, the fact that they've raised their heads and are digging in and are doing these gardens and are grappling with the work, will resonate throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. And Baltimore will feel Rockaway, and Newark, New Jersey will feel Rockaway, and the rest of New York City will. So at any rate, I've said that. Yasmin, would you like to jump in there?
Certainly. I'll jump in here because only this morning I spoke to a neighbor who was willing to have a garden, to be decided what type it would be, but it's willing to have a garden. I also identified an empty lot on my block, so I'm going to see if the neighbors on both sides would be willing to tend that garden once we find out who the owner is and if we could use that plot of land. So, the word is getting around. I know that at BPA Battalion Assembly, the congregants are going to take it on. And we have planned, we've been planning more in detail, having the press involved so that they know what the transition movement is going to look like in the Rockaways, and also getting our service organizations involved, like the Rotary, we're going to be reaching out to them. We're going to reach out to our schools, the PTA, and we are going to see, just to get people to understand that transitioning involves everybody, get the enclaves out, get in, and hopefully the health fair, well, we're going to have it. The health fair is going to be the big event to bring everyone together. So we're really working actively on this and to establish the Deep Battalion Pentecostal as the location and the hub for transitioning in the Rockaway. So we're really excited about that. I wanted to mention something, too, that Bob Nash said about organizing. And I think it's very important to organize, to have these conversations, because, again, when I use my lens as an immigrant, a recent immigrant in the last decade, I can say there is something institutionalized about the divide. There is something that pushes you, depending on color, towards a certain economic stance. And I've had to fight back a whole lot. And as a professional, I left my country, recruited by this government, as a middle class, and I come to this country and this community and twice faced homelessness, once as a result of the recruitment in 2001, and again after Sandy. And it really has been a struggle. And who do you turn to? We really need a hub for residents in every community to go to, a go-to place where it's sort of a safe haven. Something is going to happen to help you turn your life around. So I'm really very, very happy to be in on this conversation.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. I'm going to ask each speaker if they would, Yasmin, thank you I'm going to consider those closing comments and ask Joanie and Reverend Clarke if you have closing thoughts at this point. Joanie?
With all the efforts and maybe feeling not as successful in some of the things that I've attempted, I'm not giving up. And I do feel that the community will come together as things keep happening in our environment and we hear more stories. And we not only hear the negative stories of the negative impact of climate change, but the beautiful stories of what Far Rockaway is doing and taking. And what I asked was that needs to be filmed, and the people in our community need to see and know and get connected to other communities that are lifting themselves up and organizing. So we all are in this together, and I know that we can make the changes that we need to make so that life is a positive transition. And thank you for letting me be a part of this evening.
Oh, totally our pleasure. And to your point, I do want to let you know, I think Yasmin may already know, but the Canary Project from up in Syracuse is going to be filming the entire process of the permaculture installations, the meetings, the playback theater piece, the event in June, including the connection of Rockaway to the New York City hub and beyond for perpetuity. So we will catch that on film, and they are environmental artists, so they're totally resonating where we are with this. So we will catch this on film. Thank you, Joanie. Thank you, Yasmin. Reverend Clarke, would you have final thoughts?
Yes. Well, I want to thank you, Pamela, for hosting and moderating this very enlightening discussion this evening. I've learned a lot. I want to affirm Joanne's resilience and Yasmin's ingenuity And what I have taken away from this is my stance at the beginning of this forum was that I faced this challenge of how do we get people who were traditionally marginalized to organize and to deal with their own development and to take this idea of climate change seriously. And what I've come away tonight with is taking some of Joanie's resilience and Yasmin's backyard garden. I want you to tell me if you think this is going to work, because I'm excited now of creating in my church idea of backyard gardens, extending it to other churches. People can use my backyard if they want, and going to the mayor about using pots for a garden and feed and use those backyard gardens to feed disadvantaged families and communities. And I think in this working, not talking kind of thing, I think it's an easier way to communicate up the chain and to create this awareness of climate change, and that we need to be more self-reliant in some of these challenges that we face. So I want to thank everyone for just contributing to furthering my self-awareness. Thank you so much.
Truly our pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Clarke, Joanie Freeman, and Yasmin Stewart. Thank you, Bob and Philip and Larry and Derek and all the people for very, very insightful questions. We will have the recording of this for you very, very shortly, and please stay tuned. We're going to be doing this on a monthly basis. February 28th will be our next teleseminar, and we will announce that shortly. Thank you all for attending. Have a beautiful evening. Please avail yourself of the PDF, and feel free. There is an email address on the very last slide. Send your comments there, as well as please fully fill out the commentary and feedback sections of the Maestro Conference platform as well. We would love to hear from you. Thank you all, and have a good rest of the evening. Good night.